Last week, we went over which characters may or may not be possessed in Secret of the Mimic. It's a question that actually has a lot of nuance that needs to be discussed, but time and time again, we ran into characters who weren't possessed because they were being warned by the Mimic. Their erratic behaviors can be explained by the fact that the Mimic was inside of them, controlling all of their movements. So the next logical question is, if that's the case, is the Mimic possessed? Because if it is, then theoretically those characters would be possessed by something that was possessed. And that's what we're here today to discuss. I had to split this up into two parts because the first part was already very long, and whether or not the Mimic is possessed deserves its own video. So here we are. Slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Now, like last week, I still prefer to determine whether or not something is possessed by if it 1. Behaves in a way that is only explainable by possession, and 2. Has someone who can likely be the possessor. So if that's true, how does the Mimic act, and how does it behave? Well, that depends on when you're asking, because the Mimic is just the endoskeleton. The question that we have to tackle is what variant of the Mimic we see is acting in what way. Because the way I see it, there are sort of 3 eras of the Mimic. There's M1 when it was replicating Fiona, there's the moments in between when it was just a spare endoskeleton, and then there was the time when M2 was uploaded to the endoskeleton and became the Mimic we know today. So let's delve a little bit deeper into the context of when these eras of the Mimic were, and in doing so, hopefully get closer to whether or not the Mimic is possessed at any point in time here. Edwin Murray, ever obsessed with besting his best invention, the Cleanovac, was getting closer and closer to something he would later call the Mimic, an endoskeleton that could put on any costume and be any character, and something that would be invaluable for a costume manor like he owned. But he's so obsessed with building it that he buries himself deeper and deeper into work, missing some of the most important things of his life.
Get out here! You're missing it!
Just give me a minute. I had the best idea.
Okay,
This is
well,
it. This is the one. Bigger than the Cleanovac.
that's great, honey, but you're missing the party.
David's 2 years old. He won't remember a thing.
But eventually, that wife that we just heard from, Fiona, dies in a fire from Fallfest, and Edwin is suddenly unaware of what to do with himself. He's got an entire company to run and a son to raise, 2 things that he's been severely neglecting because of the whole invention thing. But it's at this time that the Mimic is finally finished. He dubs it M1. The first iteration of the Mimic, and he pivots it to watching over David while he continues to work on future iterations. The idea is that this thing could be any costume or any character to play with David while he's getting work done. But over time, Edwin sees a greater purpose for M1. He could, in a way, replace the woman he's lost. If he could train M1 to specifically replicate Fiona, a human being, using the recordings of her that he has, then this would be a much better caretaker for David. So he begins to do so, and after a while, M1 starts to be more and more like Fiona, until Edwin himself starts referring to her as Fiona.
Fiona, did you make this?
I baked it myself for David's special day.
But eventually, again due to Edwin's neglect, David dies as well. Now without a wife or child, he is completely lost as to what to do. But he did just make a robot whose primary role is to be a caretaker, and that robot no longer has anything to take care of. So M1 begins pressuring Edwin to make the second iteration of the Mimic into a replica of David, so she can have her child again, and have her main purpose be fulfilled. And Edwin does start to work on this, but after enough time, he realizes that it's a bad idea. He won't be David, and in that same sense, M1 isn't Fiona. Finally, Edwin begins to come to his senses. But in a way to distance himself from the ever-pressuring M1, he takes the personality of M1 outside of the Mimic endoskeleton and uploads it into the MXES console, renaming it to the F10N4, an acronym that just looks like Fiona. However, he still tries to make M2 functional so he can sell the product and save the company that's in the gutter. And in working on this and not figuring out why it won't work, he eventually decides maybe the reason M2 isn't functioning is because it doesn't have a proper body. So he uploads M2 into the Mimic endoskeleton. And it does work, but to his horror, one of the first things it begins replicating is his son, David. And seeing this Mimic replicating his dead son is too much for him. It goes over the line. It sends him into a fit of grief-induced rage, and he begins beating the mimic senselessly, destroying its legs and rendering it nearly inoperable.
Stop sounding like him!
He then shuts himself away in his manor to work on some other invention, but the mimic was not destroyed, merely bruised and beaten. Eventually, M2 is able to repair its own legs, and likely sabotage one of Edwin's experiments, for eventually his office explodes, and when he calls M2 to call for help, M2 resolutely ignores him, leaving him to die and letting M2, the mimic, have free reign over Murray's Costume Manor, killing any Fazbear employees sent to collect it. And that's where we begin our game. So if that's how the mimic was created and the different behaviors it exhibited throughout it, is any of that explainable or likely because of possession? Do we have any indicators that some spiritual phenomena may be happening here? Well, there is one very big piece of evidence that needs to be explained whether or not you think the mimic is actually possessed, and that's the hidden 4625 tape in the basement of Murray's Costume Manor. I've talked about this tape before on this channel. To me, it seems like this tape is Edwin trying to spirit box to see if he can communicate with Fiona after she's died. After all, it seems like he heard her down here before he had any technology, and he came back with technology hoping she could manipulate it. Now, is this actually what's happening? Is he talking to Fiona's spirit? That's up for debate. But if he is, and Fiona's spirit is down here, and he's trying to attach her to some sort of device so he can communicate with her, is this why he takes M1, something that he introduces David as just M1, a robot to put on costumes, and eventually trains it into becoming Fiona? Because something changed. He didn't make M1 for the purpose of being Fiona. We have the audio log where he introduces David to M1, but then a few years later we have the birthday tape where he's referring to her as Fiona. This possession, or at least the possession Edwin thinks happened, may have been the turning point. All this to say, this tape gives us evidence for why M1 was such a good replica of Fiona, but why M2 wasn't a good replica of anything. Because if this tape is to be believed, Fiona's spirit may have been possessing M1, leading it towards different predilections and different behaviors. But here's where things get tricky. If M1 was ever possessed by Fiona, the question that becomes what happens when M1 is placed inside of the F10N4 Mexis console, the box that we speak to in the middle of the parachute.exe ending. That's M1 now. Is Fiona still possessing it? And if so, what's going on with that? What happens to the original mimic endoskeleton? Well, I don't think F10N4 is being possessed by Fiona, and the explanation for that comes down to the way Remnant works in this franchise. That's right, we're getting into Remnant, and unfortunately, we'll also get into Agony later. So, quick refresher in case you're rusty or you're new to the franchise, in Five Nights at Freddy's, Remnant is essentially the combination of spirit and metal. What that means is, one of the ways possession gets explained in Five Nights at Freddy's is that spirits can attach themselves to metal in specific circumstances, typically if they die within that piece of machinery or are then injected later. For example, in the Silver Eyes novels, the original animatronics that the missing children are stuffed inside of get fused together into this semi-molten mess, and William Afton then takes that molten metal away from the animatronic and injects it into other animatronics to power it. In a way, Remnant is sort of like a power source, where the fuel is spiritual energy. And while it can grant possession to the thing you're injecting it to, sometimes it just powers it up. I mention all of this because it's very important into the way the mimic might be working here. To be more specific, here's a direct quote from Fazbear Frights from Dr. Talbert, not his files, just the guy, talking about how Remnant can work. Remnant is, in non-scientific terms, it's like the metal is haunted. It's more complicated than that, of course, but it's similar to the way that water conducts electricity. Remnant is the mixing of the tangible with the intangible, of memory with the present, the people and things that are lost. It makes them almost real again. So in this way, Five Nights at Freddy's is seemingly suggesting that in this universe, spirits can possess metal much more easily than other materials or objects. So consider, if Fiona was possessing the mimic endoskeleton, how would transferring M1 work. I mention all of this because of the way the possession is working with the Mimic. If the Mimic endoskeleton is possessed by Fiona's spirit, then removing the programming of the Mimic likely wouldn't remove the spirit. The spirit seems attached and affixed to the metal of the endoskeleton, not the programming within it. So when M1 was taken out of the Mimic and put into Fiona, that M1 personality, although it would be the same personality that left, would no longer be possessed by Fiona. Fiona's spirit, or at least her spiritual energy, would still be attached to the Mimic endoskeleton. And this is important for a few reasons. One, it tells us that the personality within the F10N4 box is still the same personality that was trained by Fiona's spirit, but it is no longer held back or guided by it. It's stuck in the time that it was removed. And secondly, it would tell us that very likely the endoskeleton of the Mimic has Remnant infused into it. Fiona's Remnant. Whether or not she has control or possession over the endoskeleton, it is in some way powered by her Remnant. So if that's true, and the Mimic endoskeleton still has Fiona's Remnant but not M1, what about M2? After all, M2 is leagues different from what we see than M1. Well, unfortunately, I think that's best explained through Agony. Yes, we have to talk about Agony. Similar to Remnant, we should do a quick refresher. Agony is a bit more straightforward and a bit more vague in Five Nights at Freddy's. The very basic understanding is that during incredibly tragic or traumatic events, nearby objects can be affected by the strong emotions that are present at that moment. This agony can sort of possess objects. This is used in the books to explain the phenomena of haunted objects, that the emotions themselves are possessing the nearby things and tainting them. How this works in the books and seemingly in the games like Into the Pit is that Agony can do several things. It can manifest as whole creatures, but it can also manipulate people's memory or physically manifest or do a whole litany of other things. But often, if an animatronic or something of the like was infected with Agony, that thing would become much more violent. So then, what do you think happens when Edwin starts beating M2? Let's set the scene here. M2 approaches Edwin pretending to be his son, and Edwin loses it, unleashing an attack on this machine enough to render it nearly inoperable and destroy its legs. There is a lot of agony happening in this scene. Edwin had just lost his only son, and not too long after that fact, the creation he's been desperately trying to make, that he's been failing at, that he refused to turn into David, he turns around and it pretends to be David in front of him. That would almost feel like a spit in the face. He's beating this Mimic, and frankly, it's inexcusable looking how cute this thing is. But in that moment, that beating is filled with agony. He is pouring his agony into this animatronic. All of his rage and his grief is flooding into the metal of this endoskeleton. And in that moment, not only is it powered by Fiona's Remnant, but it's being infected by Edwin's agony. So if Fiona can be explained through Remnant, and Edwin's rage can be explained through agony, is the Mimic possessed? And if so, with what? Well, in Fazbear Frights, Eleanor, the main antagonist, is seemingly a manifestation or in some way powered by agony. Yet through the entire epilogues, she's similarly seeking Remnant. She wants both, for a reason we never get to hear. But I believe the way Eleanor is acting, what she's seeking truly is power, and in her mind, having both Remnant and Agony would give her the power she craves. And we see an example of a character with Remnant and Agony in the main anti-hero of the epilogues, the Stitch Wraith, an endoskeleton with two spirits inside of it. One of those spirits has some strong connections to Remnant and abilities through it, and the other one has trapped himself in agony, leading them to kill anybody they touch for the first half of the stories. So just like that, in the games, if the Mimic endoskeleton had both Fiona's Remnant and Edwin's agony, this endoskeleton could be the strongest, most potent thing we've ever had to face against in the entire franchise. And in a way, this sort of goes back to what moon.exe was saying about the character. Moon.exe is a weird and very up to interpretation part of Secret of the Mimic, and I've made my own interpretation which you can find right here on the channel. However, there's something I want to specifically bring up that we see about halfway through moon.exe. By the end of the first segment, we build a moon statue, specifically the moon from Security Breach, that style of moon. And then once we arrive in Murray's costume manor, Mr. Helper tells us, you rebuilt yourself, but now you are split in two, moon and sun. destruction and life. If in moon.exe, Sun is meant to be Fiona and Moon is meant to be Edwin, then this is literally true if we are playing as the Mimic. By that point in the timeline, the Mimic is of two halves, Sun and Moon, Fiona's Remnant and Edwin's Agony. He is literally their son, one half of each parent, Fiona's light and Edwin's dark. We are that powerful creature that Eleanor sought to make herself into for all of Fazbear's frights, an endoskeleton powered by Remnant, fueled and infected by Agony, and able to replicate anything it sees. Perhaps more than what I've said before, that's the real secret of the Mimic, that the thing powering it isn't programming or Remnant or Agony, it's all three. Now you see why I wanted to make this a two-parter. This is a wholly different kind of video and I had to explain Remnant and Agony, it's on a whole thing. But, end of the day, if the Mimic is possessed by both Fiona's Remnant and Edwin's Agony, not only is this one of the most threatening creatures we've ever had to face up against, but it is, therefore, possessed. So don't worry, even though Five Nights at Freddy's is getting more and more sci-fi by the day, there's still plenty of supernatural phenomena to cover. In the meantime, if you didn't watch part 1, you really should, it's right here. But if you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with hashtag ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.